Desh, how you doing?
I am well. I feel properly upstaged.
Yeah, I know. I was like, of all the times I had to do this, of course, having you on, but I had to introduce our special
Of
friend
course.
today. But Desh, tell us a little bit about this movie that you recently were director of or co-director of.
Yes. So I produced and directed a film. This is actually my first film. This is my debut. It is called Islam and the Future of Tolerance. It tells the story of two people who fundamentally disagreed with each other when they first met, and over a period of 4 to 5 years, how they've developed now a friendship. They still have some disagreements, but they've managed to find a way to have a conversation about a very, very challenging subject, a subject matter that has dominated world conversation since, well, 9/11. We're obviously talking about Majid Nawaz and Sam Harris. Your audience will be quite familiar with Sam.
Yeah, probably with at least one of the two, right? Yeah.
The movie is the story of how they met, a story of who Majid Nawaz is, and where they are at now. And it is a fascinating story, of course, but it is also a carefully told thesis of a kind, how to have difficult conversations about a subject matter that a lot of people want to talk about but really don't have the tools. And I was one of those people. So with the help of a very talented filmmaker, my good friend Jay Shapiro, myself, and another group of people, we put together a film, Islam and the Future of Tolerance. And I'm glad to say that it has received really well. It is out. It has been out for a little while now, and we recently managed to add Arabic subtitles to the film as well. So it is now available, and I'm looking forward to chatting a little bit more about the film, the origins, and what we hope to achieve with this film.
Yeah, so I got the chance to watch the film before you came on, and I
Did
was
you like
watching.
it?
Oh yeah, I loved it. It was great. But one thing that happened was the film isn't super long. I think it's about an hour and 12 from what I
86
remember.
minutes.
Yeah, but my friend and I ended up spending about 4 hours watching this movie in total because we kept pausing the movie and just having conversations about it because it was really, really fascinating. You get to see kind of it's more than just the story of these two guys. Really, you're kind of going into some of the backstory of how they got to who they are today and why the conversation they're having is so important. And so you get an extra context there that you don't always normally see in documentaries that kind of talk about this subject, and the subject, of course, talking about Islam and like how to handle Islam, how to talk about Islam. Like, I guess it's like, the word used in the title is tolerate or tolerance, right? And how people interpret that, I guess, is kind of the struggle, right? Like, what does it mean to tolerate this religion? What does it mean to live in a world where other people have these beliefs? And what are the differences in some of these beliefs? Because as you and I both know, and as our listeners know, that Islam encompasses 1.7 billion people on this earth, each with varying degrees of strength in their belief and also differences in what those beliefs actually are. So I'm just curious, what actually inspired you to even make a movie like this? I think it's pretty ambitious to get both of those guys talking about a topic that can be pretty controversial.
Absolutely. And I've seen what can happen when this particular subject matter is approached cynically or in bad faith. We've had violence across the world because of movies that just choose to mock Islam or just conflate Muslim people and Islamic ideology and just paint everyone in broad brushes, etc. So the inspiration really came from the book that was written by Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz, which has the same title, Islam and the Future of Tolerance. And the genesis of this particular film, in a different life, I used to organize events in Australia and New Zealand. I used to run an organization which I founded called Think Inc. And we used to bring some of the greatest thinkers in the world to Australia and New Zealand. We used to tour them around, and we used to organize these pretty large-scale events. And we had an event with Sam Harris scheduled. And after we announced the event, Sam Harris released this book with this unknown author called Majid Nawaz, and I didn't know much about him. After reading the book, I was like, no, we have to make sure Majid is in town. I've never heard this conversation in this light. So we invited Majid over to Australia, and it was an incredibly challenging event because of the climate, because of, people did not want that conversation to be out there. I can tell many stories about what happened during that tour, but we filmed the tour with the intention of, this is an amazing conversation, let's put it on YouTube. Now, keeping in mind, the event was like a 90-minute event, and most of the event was primarily Sam Harris talking, but towards the end, we brought in Majid Nawaz and introduced Majid to Sam Harris' audience. But that 20-minute or so, and then the Q&A that followed was incredibly engaging. So we filmed it. The idea was to put it on YouTube. Then I was approached by Jay Shapiro, who is a bit more experienced filmmaker, an award-winning filmmaker. And he said, "What do you think of? Maybe we can turn this into an actual film." So that conversation led into us really turning this into a full-length feature documentary, and it took us about 1.5 years to get everything together. But yeah, so that's pretty much the genesis of this film.
And so, you mentioned earlier, obviously, I don't think I have to explain who Sam Harris is to most people who are watching this. Sam Harris is a PhD in neuroscience. He's written a bunch of books. He's an atheist speaker, and has talked a lot about, that stuff. But Majid Nawaz, I didn't know who he was either until I watched this film. So maybe you could give a bit about his background and what makes him important to this film in particular.
Well, Majid Nawaz in particular is a fascinating character. He wrote a book called Radical, which I encourage people to read. It tells his story. He was born and raised in England. His parents came from Pakistan. And he was this incredibly gifted young man who was looking for a place to find and call his own. And initially, it was hip hop. So he was a bit of a b-boy. He dabbled in rap music, but then he found his calling, or rather, he found an incredibly charismatic recruiter from an organization called Hizb ut-Tahrir. Hizb ut-Tahrir is not necessarily what you would call an extremist organization. They are what you would call an Islamist organization, which ultimately led to the recruitment of young Majid Nawaz, and Majid being so brilliant at just getting ideas out, he ended up becoming one of the global leaders of that organization and one of their top recruiters. And he really was instrumental in getting a lot of people into Hizb ut-Tahrir, and he eventually went overseas and went to Iraq, and he went to jail for his activities right on towards the end of the Arab Spring, I believe. And he served 4 years, and Amnesty International found him to be a prisoner of conscience, and he got released. See, a fascinating thing happened while he was in jail. He actually met people who he was helping in his life as an Islamist, just heading towards creating a global caliphate. These are the people he supported, but when he actually met them and hung out with them for years, he realized how insane a world would be with these people in charge. So it slowly changed his mind. And once he got released, obviously 4 years in jail, he had enough time to read amazing literature and just ponder on his own thoughts. He was constantly facing torture. So all of that combined, when he came out, he was, initially still very confused. He's still part of the organization, but slowly led a path, eventually ending up being a reformist Muslim. And he met Sam.
And that's what's really striking to me was he didn't leave the faith entirely.
No, he didn't.
He instead became a reformist for the religion, which is kind of interesting. And in thinking about my own sort of deconversion, before I became an atheist, I was a Christian, but like in the twilight of my Christianity, I probably could have been described as a Christian reformist, only in the sense that my views were so radical from other Christians that that label might have been appropriate. But he's stuck with that since then. Since his Amnesty International experience, and that's how Sam and Majid met. They were talking about Islam, and the question on that debate that they were talking about was, is Islam a religion of peace? Which Majid was in support of. Sam was, kind of on the other side of, and originally they kind of got into a bit of a fight. That they weren't super best friends at first, but then they kind of gotten to know each other a couple years later. All of this, what we're talking about, is in the movie itself. So I don't want to spoil everything that happens. Like let's let some people watch it. But in case you are curious, we do actually have a trailer for the movie that we want to play here on the show. So check it out. We're going to play this for you right now.
These type of attacks have become almost the new normal.
Our next guest is a British-born Muslim. He's a self-described former Islamic extremist.
I faced martyrdom and torturers in Egypt and thought I was going to die for my cause.
All of that I believed in.
I've always wanted to debate important ideas.
He's the author of The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason.
And I'm absolutely not a bigot. Agreeing to disagree is not only a cop-out. When it's an important issue, it's actually dangerous.
Sam and I first met a few years ago.
Sam, I remember, asked a very pertinent set of questions to Majid, which I remember thinking, oh, that's going to hurt.
I looked at him straight in the eyes and said, "Are you accusing me of lying?"
I thought maybe he would hit Sam.
If they were to ever get together again, it would be interesting.
Is this still a good time?
We have the time you need.
We have got to overcome this idea that people don't have the right to criticize our religion just like we criticize everything else.
You can't say that the central message of Islam is pacifism, whereas you could say that of a religion like Jainism.
I don't accept that there's a correct reading of Scripture.
There is a link between belief and behavior.
How do you talk about this honestly without empowering right-wing illiberalism?
You may have the Bible Belt. We Muslims have our own Quran belt.
I'm not denying that certain people are bigoted against Muslims as people. And that's a problem.
But why are you so hostile about this?
It's gross. It's racist. I'm less worried about bombs than I am about ideas.
We've got to get out of this, it's all of Islam, or it's got nothing to do with Islam.
It's compelling to many liberals to say, well, who are we to judge anyone else? We occupy nothing like moral high ground. This is the conversation that I had never had and I had never seen had.
This conversation has to continue. One of the most pressing issues of our day.
We live in perpetual choice between conversation and violence. That's really all we have. And there's been far too much violence already.
Sweet. So yeah, that movie again is available right now. It's on Amazon and stuff. So if you want to go check it out after you're done with this show, of course, because you gotta watch the stream here. But yeah, I recommend it. It was really interesting, and I want to ask you, Desh, about kind of the central, thesis to Sam and Majid's work. Like this idea of being able to criticize Islam is something that they both agree on. They may have a difference in opinion on exactly how to interpret Islam or what is proper for Islam, but they both seem to come to the conclusion that it's worth talking about. And that's something that historically it can be kind of complicated, especially an individual such as myself, who never grew up in Muslim culture, who is a white guy from the United States, who grew up in Christianity. The rhetoric that you hear about Islam over here isn't always the most scholarly, let's put it that way. And so when people talk about it, it's not always in the friendliest terms. Whereas what seems to be advocated in the movie is, you can talk about it in a more reasoned way and figure out, maybe some problems with it and see what you can do to reform it. But almost coming from again, someone who didn't grow up in that culture, who isn't going to know as much as probably the average Muslim, it seems like my part in that conversation is going to be a bit limited in some sense. I probably know more than the average person about Islam, but there is kind of a feeling of restraint there when talking about Islam's and the potential problems that may come with it. So what is your response to someone who would have a position like mine that says I like talking about it, but it can be a bit uncomfortable?
So let me quote Majid Nawaz. Majid says, he says in the movie that you don't have to be gay to fight for gay rights. You don't have to be black to condemn racism. You don't have to be from the Islamic community or a Muslim to challenge Islamic theocracy. There has been a concerted effort over 2 decades with well-meaning people conflating Islam and Muslim people. See, this sounds like an obvious thing, but so many occasions when people are talking about an ideology, they are referring to Muslims, which that's a group of people. Right. Just like, there are Jewish people who do not consider them to be devout. They are just culturally Jew. There are lots of Muslim people who are, because of the culture, because they were born into a community as Muslims. And when you have a country like Pakistan, your identity to your country is connected to this particular religion. But a lot of progressive Muslims will actually agree with this particular point, and now it has a bit more of a voice, which is one can talk about the ideology without demonizing a group of people. See, we have to acknowledge anti-Muslim bigotry is an actual thing. People have this, just like Jewish people are attacked for being Jew, Muslim people are attacked for being Muslim, which they had nothing to really do with. A lot of, from the 1.7 billion Muslims you mentioned earlier, majority of them were born into that religion, right?
Sure.
And people who have issues with Islamic ideologies tend to go after Muslim people when the smartest thing to do is to challenge the ideology. Now, my advice and what I learned as well is quite simply, if you have the right language, the communication tools, anyone should be able to have this conversation. And that is the primary purpose of this movie. This movie gives you the language and the tools you need to have a better conversation about this particular subject matter and overall just conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Truth Wanted, and this show in particular, we're a show that likes to talk about people's ideas and what people believe and why. That's kind of the whole thing, right? And I've never ever had the thought cross in my mind that if I'm ever talking about Islam, that I'm referring to particular Muslims, or that I'm talking about Muslims as a whole. And I think you're right. There is often a conflation there. I think also too that from my generation, people seem to be a bit more tolerant of it. I mean, this is I always bring this up because it makes the crew feel really old, but I was about 5 years old when 9/11 happened, for example. So that isn't even a cultural memory that's relevant to me, because it didn't really happen when I was cognizant enough to be able to understand like the political implications of something like that. You know what I mean? Now I've certainly seen the results of something like that in the United States, where there's tons of Muslim bigotry that happens all the time. Most of it just in closed doors. But I also recognize that there are things that I would want to talk about and want to point out, like the practice of female genital mutilation. Obviously that's not a practice that goes on everywhere, but like as a secular humanist, that goes against my values, and that's going to be something that I would want to talk about, regardless if it's a cultural practice. Like the kind of idea that something is cultural and therefore should be protected, while it has its merits, is also extremely limited, especially when we're talking about human harm and stuff, right? So yeah, I've had a couple of different ex-Muslims come on to talk about Islam and stuff, and I seem to get the same response every time, which is, yeah, feel free to talk about it. Don't be afraid to, just because it's not a culture of your own. But I still want to try to be as respectful and make the other person feel at ease as best as I can if I ever do talk about it. I don't think I've talked to a whole lot of Muslims on this show, but if I do, I want to make sure that they're at the right place, and knowing that, hey, like, we can talk about this and hopefully you don't feel personally attacked. We're just talking about the ideas that you bring on the table, right?
I think, Dan, you should invite some progressive Muslims and reforming Muslims onto this show, because you are right. The younger generation is a lot more open to talking about this, and there is somewhat of an enlightenment revolution, reformist revolution happening, and it's been happening for a little while. And I think the book Sam and Majid wrote and the movie we made is going towards that, and the ex-Muslim movement is doing incredible work.
Yes,
because you may have seen there's an influx of young people who are living in these Islamic theocratic countries are fleeing those countries. And that is a lot of credit needs to go to this ex-Muslim movement and the work they're doing. And I mentioned earlier that our film now has Arabic subtitles. It was a very, very big deal for us. I wanted to do that from the get-go, but it took us some time. So if you're in the Middle Eastern countries, you can now watch the movie and you can turn on Arabic subtitles. And that was thanks to IBB, Ideas Beyond Borders, which is run by Faisal Al-Mathur and Melissa Chen. And Faisal is an ex-Muslim. So it is important that more we talk about this, more we normalize this conversation, and really push back on the idea that we are going after people, and really point out, no, this we are going after ideas. The funniest thing is, I consider myself a classical liberal, right? We tend to be for the marginal, the people who don't have a voice, right? And I think every human being should be, but because of this idea that if we were to talk about some of these cultural practices, somehow that might be used by racist people to subjugate those people, it is this inherent, coming from a good place worry. But we should be able to talk about things like FGM, and we should be able to challenge that and saying that is abhorrent. That should not be. It doesn't matter which culture it comes from.
Right.
It's a terrible thing. It doesn't matter, how important that is for that culture. It doesn't really matter. It is, this is about the human condition, right? We should be able to. There are some universal morals and ethics that we all should be able to agree on. And when you mentioned that, I remember, for a long time, and we have I think one mention of a gentleman by the name of Reza Islan, who is quite a famous apologist. He's debated Sam many times. There was this clip that went viral some time ago where he's really going after a CNN reporter, basically calling her a bigot, more or less, for challenging the FGM, widespread FGM practice among a particular faith, this being Islam, and he basically says, no, this religion doesn't have a problem with FGM. It is a African practice. It went viral because people thought he's an incredible orator, and people thought, it's true. But the reality is he was conflating information. He is right. It is widely practiced around countries in Africa, but he conveniently left out, certain countries that have Muslim minorities where it's prevalent, like the Bora community in India. This is the thing. It's important this is why I encourage people who want to have a conversation, a good faith conversation, to watch this movie so you have the right tools and the knowledge. And it is not about just loading yourself up with facts, but it's just a general bit of information so you can have these honest dialogues. And one should not be scared to engage with somebody who's religious, who's of the faith of Islam, to engage in a conversation. And a lot of them, what I find difficult is when you're online, when you're having a Twitter exchange, it's generally hard to get messages across. It's very easy for someone to take something you say out of context or have a bad faith argument. I think if you're among friends, if you know people of the faith, just like, I'm sure a lot of your listeners would have been quite comfortable with having conversations with Christians.
Oh, yeah. I'll dunk on that all day. That's my bread and butter right there.
Here's the thing, Dan. You should be able to have the same line of communication, and we should be in a world where we can do that. And I get a lot of pushback from my community. I'm originally from Sri Lanka, where I have fairly poignant questions about Buddhism, and Buddhism is considered one of the more milder versions of faiths out there. But I have my fair share of issues with that religion as well. But I'm doing it with I'm challenging the ideas. I'm not challenging the people, right? And that's an art that a lot of people have with Christianity. Reality is just you can do the same thing with Islam as well.
Yeah. Well, I believe in good faith conversations, and I want to be able to have some with you right now. We got some callers that are ready to talk to you. So you're ready to talk to some people today?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.